Hello, trauma thrivers. Welcome back for another interview, but this time for an interview that I'm really looking forward to. Not, of course, that I haven't been with all the others, but this is a special guest. It's Dr. Paul Hokemeyer, who is joining us from America, and I'm delighted to say hello to him this morning. Morning, Dr. Paul. I know it's morning for you, late afternoon for me. And for those of you watching, I just want to introduce Dr. Paul to you. He's an author and an internationally renowned clinical and consulting psychotherapist. He's a founding principal of Drace and Muse International, and he works with individuals and families all over the world. Dr. Paul has been featured as a guest on so many media forums and TV shows. We'll probably run out of time if I mention them all here, but just to say, from Dr. Oz to Good Morning America to the Today Show, just to name a few. Dr. Paul is also very well known in the field for having treated some of the world's most successful people, which he's written about in his acclaimed book, Fragile Power: Why Having It All Is Never Enough, which is a totally brilliant read. And it sets out to answer why so many people who have everything or seem to have everything end up feeling like their achievements are never enough, as well as what that pattern can reveal about ourselves and the society in which we live. So I really want to talk today to Dr. Paul about the book, but also what's happening in the world in the light of COVID-19. But firstly, as I usually do with these interviews, Dr. Paul, is I like to ask about your own background and what led you into this field to start with.
Well, that's a long, let's see whether I can abbreviate that one, because I'm not a spring chicken, and it's taken me several careers actually to get where I am. I started my career in a very traditional way. I was an economics major in college, went into banking, decided that I wanted more education, and became a lawyer, and I practiced as a corporate lawyer for a number of years. I really came to realization pretty quickly that wasn't how I wanted to spend the rest of my life fighting with people. And so I went into the realm of environmental justice, and I worked for, actually I lived in Amsterdam and worked for Greenpeace International for a while. And I was actually living in Amsterdam when September 11th happened. And as a white privileged male who had grown up in America, the security of my world had been guaranteed until it wasn't on that day. And it was a very traumatic experience for me. The safety and security of my world was very threatened. And so I returned back to America, and I kind of had an existential crisis. I really decided to look for significant meaning in my life. And I decided to focus on behavioral health, mental health. And I went back to school, and I got a master's degree in clinical psychology with a focus on family systems. And I was observing in the world, and as part of that process, the school was very progressive and really focused on the importance of cultural competency and working with minority populations. And I observed that the minority populations that were being focused on were people who lived in the world in positions of powerlessness. Right. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because here we are in a world where we have minority of people who live in the world of extraordinary power. Yes. And we haven't developed any clinical formulations to help manage those people. And there's a host of problems that are resulting from the separation and from the division. Income inequality, if we think about it, is an extraordinary problem that only seems to be, that doesn't seem, that is getting worse. And so I decided to go back to school. You'll see there's a pattern here. I'll have like an existential crisis, and I'll decide to go back to school and get another degree. I'm kind of out of degrees, but I don't think I'm out of existential crises.
I don't know whether we ever are we?
God willing, I think, right?
Yeah.
It's a gift to be able to think about these things. And so I went back to university, and I did my PhD, and I studied power constructs. What does it mean to be a person of great wealth? What does it mean to be a celebrity? And I did that work, and I looked at it at 3 levels of our existence: the intrapersonal, the interpersonal, and the social cultural. And then that set forth the trajectory of my work in the book Fragile Power, which is the culmination of that, in terms of understanding what is it like to be in that experience. And then I've developed a clinical formulation to effectively treat those human beings so that they can begin to connect more with their humanity first and the humanity that they live in, and develop the capacity to empathize with people other than themselves and develop compassion. And now my existential goal in life is to really help to ameliorate the division that we have in our world, particularly between the have and the have-nots, because the top-down, top-up approach isn't working.
Yes.
My work focuses, and our work focuses on enabling people to connect with their humanity first and then humanity, so that they can move themselves and the world in a reparative direction. And there's a lot of repair that we need to be focusing on right now.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of what you say and what we're witnessing of collective trauma and societal trauma that's taking place. I mean, this interview is taking place in the time of COVID-19, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, and what that means, but also in the whole context of Black Lives Matter and everything that's happening, certainly on stateside for you at the moment. It feels like there is a lot of fragile power happening. I mean, the title of the book couldn't be better at the moment, you know, in some ways. And then underlying that, I guess you've been talking about trauma quite a lot, and that collective and national trauma. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about that.
Well, my trauma work focuses on, attachment. So there's a breach in attachment. And so there's a disconnection from security in the world. And I think of where we look at where we are collectively as a human race, regardless of what country we live in. We're living in extraordinary disconnection. We're all suffering from, I think, attachment disorders, because the foundations of our lives that we look to for security have been rattled. And that's been particularly true in America. Because in America, with the election of Donald Trump, that was a huge disruption. Nobody really saw that. Well, some people clearly did, but Donald Trump is a disruptor.
Yes.
And so that's every day with him, there's something new and different and changing. And for human beings who need a secure environment, it's very disruptive and very traumatic. And then we have come to the fore realities that we thought had been taken care of. Racial injustice in terms of America.
Yes.
Gun violence, economic insecurity. I mean, the list goes on, doesn't it?
Yeah, totally.
And my work is really grounded in feminist theory and feminist thought and the collaborative approach. But if you look at feminist theory, it was that the political is personal, right? And the personal is political. And so personal ills could be solved and healed by the political process.
Yeah.
Well, we're living in quite a different reality now, aren't we?
Yeah.
Where the political process
Yes.
itself is causing an enormous amount of social and emotional unrest. And I think, you have that over in Brexit, right?
Yeah, totally. And almost in the way that we handled COVID-19 and the crisis, and the way that, that our instability, if you like, is continuing in the world, in the face of how the UK is viewed even as a country. So that political side, you're right, and that national trauma becomes a kind of collective trauma. And for those of us that have experienced detachment disruptions, who you rightly say, we kind of almost look to our leaders, don't we, or our hierarchical structures for some sort of grounding or stability or safety. And it's not there. Or it's the likes of Donald, who you wouldn't want to rely on for, let's face it, lending you a fiver,
Well, it's a narrative of betrayal, isn't it? And so we, like if we look, so we're looking on a macro level, what trauma people will experience traumatically, individually, and we're awakening to the fact that we have given our power away. I want to say recklessly, but actually we've been seduced
Yes.
into giving our power away to people who don't deserve it and who can't handle it and
Yeah.
use it to betray us.
Yes.
And so for human beings who have a very deep trauma schema set up in their life where they've been betrayed by a primary caregiver, now on this macro level, we're experiencing this extraordinary trauma.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you talked about in the book the kind of tribal and the hierarchical and the patriarchal society, and how we look, if you like, to systems of power or people of power, which is what I'm sure you know much more about this than me, but what wealth and fame and success means. That really sometimes I think, I wonder if it's only in this generation or time now that we would elect a president as such, or we would look to those systems for kind of safety or security. That in essence, I think you're saying in the book that some of those systems have fragility underneath that, what we think is safe and secure, i.e. the money or the power or the wealth or the beauty or the fame. They're all kind of unstable, if you like, structures, aren't they, as such?
Well, that's just it, isn't it? And I think, I blame a lot of this to technology. And I think that our humanness has not been able to keep pace with technology. And so if you look at historically other industrial revolutions, they've occurred over an extended period of time. And so our central nervous systems have been able to connect, to restructure, because human beings are extraordinarily adaptive. And we adapt, and we are adapting quite effectively to COVID. And so so I think that what happened was we've been seduced into buying a veneer. The veneer of success, the veneer of celebrity. And there hasn't been really any work given towards that. Where historically a celebrity, let's say for instance, Judy Garland, right? Is an extraordinary talent, right?
Yes, amazing.
And so that cultivation of talent. And so now we have internet celebrities and we have reality TV stars. And then our central nervous system hasn't been able to sort out, if you will, the difference between what's authentic and credible and reliable, and that which is a veneer and a fad and unstable and not worthy of our power.
Yeah. And I suppose that's about, underneath those veneers or underneath those structures, how secure we feel within ourselves, or that nervous system feels to connect to, which is, I guess, our job as therapists, isn't it? To try and create that stable base and that connectedness with somebody. We have to do our own trauma work and try and become more solid structures. I don't know quite whether solid is the right word to use, but
no, I think it's a very good word. I think solid is the word. It's building an internal scaffolding, if you will, that's solid and that's reliable in ourselves. And that, trauma people who our instincts, we don't necessarily trust our instincts, particularly when a primary caregiver who was supposed to protect and nurture us betrayed us.
Yeah.
And so there's this disconnection. And so, the more I work with trauma, the more I realize that talk therapy will only get you so far.
Yes.
That you really need to go deeper into the central nervous system, and you need to go deep into the unconscious. And so, I'm working with a patient now who has just contacted me and has been doing trauma work for decades, if you will. And, for the first time, I recommended him do acupuncture.
Yeah.
And deep tissue massage.
Yes.
And so getting deeper into the
body,
into the body, I do feel that it's very much an embodiment that need to address holistically.
Yeah.
And the talk therapy can only get you so far. It's the relational aspect is important. So my work and your work is very critically tied to the integrity of the relationship and the
Yes.
therapeutic alliance, and having that safe, contained, structured space where you mirror the patient, you see them for authentically who they are, and then you appropriately challenge them to move in a reparative direction. That's a bit of an art, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a complete art. It's a dance, really, isn't it?
It's a dance.
Yeah, because you're treating people or trying to get people to trust who haven't found it easy to trust others, and then added to that for you and the niche that you work with, I would think that the wealthy and the famous, I know, because in reading your book, it suddenly came into my consciousness as I was reading it, that my first 3 bosses, one was a billionaire and the other 2 were millionaires. And so I kind of saw that extremeness on that side in my 20s. And then I ended up working in radio for 8 years and putting bands and pop stars on the stage. So I had a real first kind of 30 odd years of my life seeing all that side of it and the other side of it. So it brought back quite a lot of memories reading your book about being on the other side and seeing that it's not all it's cracked up to be at all.
Well, and there's an extraordinary amount of vulnerability associated with it, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, when we think about the creative process, any act of creation involves criticism.
Yes. Yes.
People
Even writing a book.
We're certainly writing a book or a video. Is people are going to like it or dislike? You know what I mean? Like there's
we're gonna get a thumbs up.
Yeah, we're gonna get a thumb up or a thumbs down. Hopefully, we have enough of the internal scaffolding that can.
Hopefully, please.
And we have enough of a relationship that I can call you. I can say, "Lou, did you see that?" I could just rig you up. But any act of creation, doesn't it? It's inherent in it is criticism, and so and the vulnerability and what's happened historically, and that's why I really appreciate you embracing the book in a way that you have, because historically, when you have people of power, celebrities in particular, who go into treatment, they're objectified and manipulated.
Yeah, totally.
Because clinicians can't hold the enormity of the power that they bring with them.
Yeah.
And the field of behavioral health, particularly addiction treatment, over the last 20 years, there's been an explosion of treatment centers that market to people of wealth.
Yeah.
But up until my book, there hasn't been any clinical roadmap for effectively treating this particular population. And now look, this isn't an analysis of better than, less than, more deserving, less deserving. If you're a human being who comes onto this planet, you deserve clinically competent, culturally relative care.
Yes,
right?
Totally.
So period. That's. I don't think that you can assign an economic threshold on who deserves cultural care. And when you look at the nature of treatment, if you look at my research shows that there are 3 distinct cultural markers of this particular population.
Yeah, that would be really interesting to hear for the audience, if you don't mind sharing those markers with us.
No, of course. So the first is isolation. Right. So people of wealth and celebrities are profoundly isolated in the world. The second one is suspiciousness of outsiders, so that they're constantly on hyper alert. Do you like me for who I am, or for my surname, or for my bank account, for what I can do for you? And the third construct, which is very unique to this population, is a notion of what's called hyperagency, which is to manipulate your world to avoid any discomfort.
Okay, yes.
So flying private is the best example. I'm not going to go to Heathrow and deal with those queues and all of those people. I'll just, but that it goes much deeper than that. Now, when you think about what we ask a patient to do in therapy, well, it goes against every single one of those cultural markers, doesn't it?
Yes.
We're asking you to come out of your isolation, connect with another human being who you are going to be suspicious of their motives, and to tolerate discomfort while they poke around your trauma background or your, the things that you have been hiding and trying to stuff down for
Yeah.
your whole life. So we wonder why Marilyn Monroe died. We wonder why Whitney Houston died.
Yeah.
We wonder why the list goes on and on and on, isn't it? Because the mental health profession has not adequately addressed these distinct cultural markers and developed clinical formulations to treat them, which is what I've done in my book.
Which is brilliant because, pain has got no economic background, has it? So, I think that sometimes people think that the wealthy or the famous or the rich are kind of problemless, if you like, because they don't suffer with the same inadequacies or issues that the rest of us, mere mortals do, but they've got exactly the same things and problems going on, and if not compounded by all of that wealth or status or expectation, surely.
It's different. It isn't better than or less than,
Yeah.
and that was one of the revelations for me. And one of the things that I wrote about in my book was that, I grew up as a middle-class white male in America. And so the dominant cultural message that I was taught and that I internalized and believed was that money was the key to all. If you had money, then you can solve all the problems in your world.
Totally. And I grew up in Thatcher. Yes. It was just like, oh my God, you got to make a mint to mean anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And the more material possessions you have, the more you can isolate yourself. And that is true, right? The more protection. Look, let's not pretend that money doesn't buy the healthiest food, the safest cars, enables us to live in the best neighborhoods. Right. I mean, we don't need to but basically what we need to do is develop what I think is a responsible thing for our profession to do is, if we know we're dealing with a minority population, which we are, top 10%, top 1%, then we have an obligation as clinicians to develop clinical formulations that meet them in their clinical markers, just as we would as a woman, just as we would as a person of color, just as we would as a gay and lesbian transgender person, right? Just as we would as a Muslim, just as we would as a Jew. Look, every person comes with a distinct cultural identity. And as clinicians, we need to honor and recognize those.
Is there anything that you would say to clinicians watching this? Because I know that part of Trauma Thrivers, obviously we've got quite a high clinical percentage, about what they can do to be culturally competent. God, that's a bit of a tongue twister. But, everybody that's watching this, that tips that you could give them when they are working with that client population.
Yeah, I think so. It's read the book. Actually, chapter 7 and
that
chapter
would be
8.
a really good idea.
If I could do that, or you can, develop, sort of get over this construct of less than better than thing. And it's about sort of delivering culturally competent services. First of all, pay attention to your own, what we call countertransference reaction to it. If you're having a negative reaction to it, then that's something you need to pay attention to. If you're thinking this is just bullocks, if this is just not, what are you talking about? That's very significant. When I was doing my dissertation, I was looking for my dissertation committee, and I interviewed a very esteemed existential psychotherapist, world-renowned, and I told him about my work, and he said, well, Paul, why would you waste your time studying rich people? And I said, well, for the very reaction that you just had. He was not. His ego was such that he couldn't get it. But it got done. The research got done, and recognize that this is a distinct cultural population, and that you're dealing with isolation and suspiciousness of outsiders. And then when that patient is challenging you and testing you, it's because they are looking to see, are you trustworthy?
Yes.
And you need to be trustworthy.
Yeah.
You can't tell them that you're, just because I wrote a book and just because I developed my research around this, patients who work with me and who I work with in a long time have to feel that I can hold, that I am worthy of holding the enormity of their pain, because they can't.
Yeah.
And so supervision is critically important, like establishing a connection of other, people in
Yes.
our community.
Yeah.
We're starting to develop a nice international community
That's really,
around the world around these issues, which is really
yeah.
important.
Yeah, it is. It's great to work in a group. And also, we know with trauma and trust that unless somebody trusts you, they can't enter their window of tolerance and be in ventral vagal and feel relaxed enough to be able to even connect to you authentically, which is, our right hemisphere engages to their right hemisphere, and we're kind of the affect regulator, aren't we, or the modulator. And if you've got no trust, you've got no right hemisphere engagement. So we're kind of, I hear you on that. And
that happens on a sort of limbic system level. That's not a
even conscious.
cognitive thing. It's
Yeah,
especially, we're constantly in hypervigilance. Can
yeah,
I trust you? Can you hold the enormity of my pain? Will you betray me?
yeah. And the added thing, I suppose, is that, confidentiality and holding that boundary and never revealing anything for people like that, that's another added, I would think, concern for them as well. Are the contents of this entirely safe? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in terms of you and trauma work and moving forwards, what's your thoughts on how we're going to approach this kind of collective, or what I call, well, it is collective trauma, it's world trauma, and come out the other side of COVID and everything else that we're going through? What would you like to see happen?
Well, what I would like to see happening is what I think is happening, and that is that we are expanding by contraction.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a segment of humanity that's going to be elevated by this, and so there's going to be an expansiveness of consciousness and connection and an understanding of the importance of life. That happened through contraction because we were all kind of sent to our rooms by Mother Nature, weren't we? Mother Nature.
And I think you said somewhere in one of your articles that I was reading that, the mental health kind of epidemic, if you like, escalated in America, but then more people have maybe reached out for help over the last few months too. So it's kind of awakened, if you like, our society or our need to maybe, because as you say, we can't really change what's happening out there per se, but maybe what we can do, each of us individually, is start to change what's happening in here.
Well, we can talk. It's what we've talked about before. You said strength, and we defined it as scaffolding, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so we have been forced to spend an extraordinary amount of time with self.
Yes.
Some of it good, some of it not so good. I have days that are kind of, that are not so great. Yesterday was one of them, where I just had a day where I was just feeling overwhelmed by the endlessness of this. And so by spending more time with self, we've been able to edit out things that are important. And it's interesting, right? What we're realizing, the things that we don't need.
Yeah.
It was interesting. I was talking to a patient of mine yesterday, and she lives in New York City, and she was walking down Fifth Avenue, and she went down by Gucci, and she said, Gucci used to mean like Gucci really has no relevance in the world that I live in anymore. And she used to think that it was something, and so I think that we are being able to make our footprints smaller.
Yeah.
And then, but have more meaning and purpose in what our footprints are. And I think that for those people who are conscious, and I suspect everyone who's watching this video is conscious, that this is a real opportunity to create really deep meaning in your life, right?
Yeah.
There's a third of the population who are just totally going through this totally unconsciousness, will not change anything about their lives. There's another third that will make some adjustment, but there's another third, and I suspect it's the audience that we have here, who really are looking to use this in a reparative way to to expand their humanness
Yeah.
in the world as opposed to their material footprint in the world. I certainly am.
Yeah, me too. And you talk a lot about, you know, having a vision or a mission or a plan or I can't remember the words in the book that you use about the importance of that. And also you do an exercise around values, which I think is interesting. And I wonder whether you'd mind sharing that, because that feels to me like it's a kind of inner scaffold too.
It's very much an inner scaffolding. So we have to reclaim our individual human values.
Yeah.
My human values, the three legs of the stool on which I sit are freedom,
Yeah.
connectivity, freedom from mental health disorders, freedom from trauma response,
Yeah.
freedom from addictive disorders, freedom from pathological relationships, right?
Be nice.
Connectedness,
Yeah.
feeling a sense of connectedness to the world. For me, I happen to have the privilege now of living in nature. And I'm about 3,000 meters above sea level in
Oh, are you?
a mountain town in Colorado. And
Oh,
so
wow.
for me, it's reconnecting. I was in New York City for years, and now I'm reconnecting. I go swimming in an alpine lake every afternoon because
Do you?
it's just connecting
Yeah, yeah.
with Mother Nature, and I need to feel more grounded. I need to get dirty.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, my version of doing that is walking the dog every morning in the pouring rain in London or Surrey, should I say today. But yeah.
And picking up the dog do, which is it's an act of humility, isn't it?
Yeah. Totally. So
We
people
need to,
have to pick their own values, like find their own values.
right. And
Yeah,
find three.
find three values. And
Yeah.
then what do they do once they found those values? What did you do with yours?
Be intentional about honoring them in some way every day, and
Okay.
just we have to be intentional with our lives, don't we? Because
Yeah.
particularly people who suffer from a trauma background, because they're so reactive, their central nervous system is set up to react. And
Totally.
so we need to mediate that with intentionality. And one of the other gifts, I think, of the constriction of our lives and in our COVID world is recognizing that this doesn't go on forever, does it?
Nothing goes on forever, does it?
That the fragility of life is very much in our face and in our fore. And that is important because it gives meaning to life. And
Yeah.
And really, this isn't to be taken for granted, is it? And
No, but I think nothing can be taken for granted, really. And I think that's what it's waking us up to. And I think that's has its positives as well, in that maybe it brings in at some point some more gratitude for each day in the life that we have got and that we're blessed with.
Amen. I think that's exactly right. And one of the things that I recommend all my patients do, regardless of, your place on the economic spectrum, is to do a gratitude list. I think, basic tools like coming up every morning for three things for which the first thing you do is focus your consciousness on gratitude.
Yeah.
That will set you for the rest of the day. And then live as best you can in the 24 hours, which is very, 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 very difficult. So yeah, but I do think connecting, if we don't claim our values, they will be handed to us by people who aren't deserving of our trust, and potentially will betray us.
Yeah. And it's finding those relationships too, isn't it? To have people that are, we are willing to trust, because I think we create trauma in relationships, but we also heal in relationships too.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And it's finding those relationships that we are, there's been a lot of really great work that's come out around vulnerability and vulnerability as a construct. And I think it's entered the realm of pop culture, perhaps. We tend to get a little too far with these things, don't we?
Yeah.
And so for me, I practice strategic vulnerability, particularly if I have a patient that has a trauma background.
Yeah.
So know the people with whom you're sharing your vulnerability, and be strategic in how you're
Yeah.
doing it, because this carte blanche, open book, vulnerable with everybody, and the leading clinicians in the realm of vulnerability don't espouse this, but I
Yeah.
think sometimes that when this gets picked up by the popular media, the message becomes one of, carte blanche vulnerability is a good thing, and that's a very dangerous
Yeah.
proposition.
Yeah. I'd like to honor your vulnerability at the beginning of each chapter.
That was rough.
Sharing
That
your
was
own
sort of rough for
story.
me.
Yeah, that feels like it must have been a bit uncomfortable. But actually, those were the parts of the book that really touched me, because I felt like I could connect to you more in those moments and know you, especially as the young boy who wasn't so smart, or the things that we become.
Right?
Yeah, so young about ourselves,
Mm.
which I don't know, for me, maybe make us or you or we the clinicians that we are, because without some understanding of woundedness, it's very difficult to ever, and I never profess to ever sit in a gilded cage. I like your analogy that we are with somebody and there is no hierarchical structure in the job and the work that we do. Yeah.
Right. No matter how much people want to project on us
Yeah.
to positions of authority, right?
Yeah.
Particularly me as a white male, there's an enormous amount of power that gets thrown to me, and people want me to solve their problems. And I have a PhD and a law degree, and so there's a lot of expectations. And so I have to work very diligently to work collaboratively with the patient. And I think that there is, the notion of the wounded healer is very, very particular. The trick becomes, how do you take the wound, and how do you, I think it has to happen in a frame. I think that, one of the things that I find very important is that even though the work that we do clinically is an art, it needs to be grounded in very solid science.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I've done with my book. This isn't just my opinion. I've based my work on established theoretical constructs and empirical science, and I move it into advance it in a new direction, which is what innovation is. And we have to constantly be innovating. We have to constantly be growing. We have to constantly be expanding what it means to treat, what it's like to treat trauma. Like how we treat trauma today is not the same as we treated it 20 years ago, is it?
Yeah, no. I like to frame it as a journey of continuous becoming. That's my phrase.
Beautiful.
Even for us therapists, and it's an endless journey of still treating our own trauma, or certainly for me, I wouldn't profess yet to any of my patients or clients to be 100% trauma free.
Right.
And even around the dog, who acts out all of my trauma or anxiety if I let him. So yeah, we have to be aware of that. So the future for you, Dr. Paul, now, what would you like to do personally? Now you've got this book done, what do you have an idea of what's next for you? Where you would like to go?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that this is it. I mean, I think that, again, I was banging around the world pretty well, and I think for me, being able to force, to sit in one place, 3,000 meters above sea level, where the air is, there isn't a lot of oxygen up here.
Yeah. I've been up there, I guess.
But, I think people are saying, like, what's your next book? And I, like, this book was a very personal journey for me. And I'm very grateful to Hazelden for giving me the opportunity to say what I wanted to say in a way that I wanted to say it, because a lot of other mainstream publishers wanted to put this tick off boxes for this book. Yeah. And Hazelden was like, this can be, I said, let's say melange of things, isn't it? It's a personal journey. It's a clinical book. It's a trade book. It has personal stories. And so Hazelden really gave me the opportunity to do that. And I look at this as my child. I look at it, the fragile power, as my daughter. I call her Franny. Yeah. And
lovely.
and I'm quite protective of it as to how she gets introduced into the world.
Yes.
And I feel like she's still in her nappies, you know,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
so I feel like I kind of want to get her out in the world in a way that sort of sets her up. I don't feel like she's found her space yet,
Yeah.
and I don't feel like she's found her mates, and I don't feel like so I kind of want to spend the next year, 2 years, 3 years, kind of helping her get settled into the world
Yeah.
before I
Lovely.
think about writing another book. Now, mind you, you know, I am a writer, and that's my passion, and so I do think perhaps about writing a book about collective trauma
Yeah.
uh, and you know, where in our post-COVID world, it will be more of like a self-help genre,
Okay.
because
Yeah.
one of the issues with Fragile Power is that it's a melange. It captures a number of different. It doesn't tick off. It doesn't fit into one box, which is brilliant because I don't fit into one box.
No, you definitely don't. And I love the way that it doesn't fit into one box, because anybody could read it, from you know, a celebrity to a clinician to I mean, the audience is kind of vast, and everybody would get something from it, even, you know, from a lay person or non-professional or understanding. So that's what I liked about it.
Oh, good. Yeah, and the other side is, you know, my practices has picked up a bit, and I had been really doing a lot of consulting work and writing, and you know, the universe gives us what we need, and
It does.
so here I am being able to sit with human beings in this new world order, in this new reality, and that is really rich and meaningful. So
Yeah.
I've always had a small practice. I still have a relatively small practice, and because the nature of the work is so intense,
Yes.
um, so that's probably what I think of doing, and working internationally, because I feel as though from a micro level, we're becoming so divided. Brexit, America, you know, we're closing our borders and all of
Yeah.
that. I want to be able to work internationally with people on a very intimate level, to connect our humanness while we're living in this ethos of division. And so I think that there will be a return. Look, I don't, my work doesn't scale. You know,
Yes.
I am a knitter. I
Yes.
basically work with one human being
At a
at a
time.
time to
Yeah.
bring reparative change. And so I feel called to do that work more
But
deeply.
also, I suppose, you know, in your defense, whereas, you know, trauma thrivers, I'm trying to create and want to create something that hits more mainstream and more masses, and maybe the opposite end of the spectrum to you, you know, people that are struggling financially or don't have the wealth to be able to afford therapy or treatment. I kind of feel
Right.
called to that audience now. You know, but what if change you do effect in a world where we are starting to become divided or not connected and separate, and see our brothers and sisters as more separate, in essence, down to our leadership and power structures and stuff, the people that you do work with, you can effect enormous change in them, because they are the ones, if you like, that already have the voices.
Well, that's just exactly it, right? And the resources too. And I think
Yeah.
that if we look historically, demanding that people act a certain way hasn't worked. What we've tried has not worked.
No.
It's only gotten worse. It's only gotten markedly worse
Yeah.
around the world. And so I think let's try something different.
Yeah.
Let's try to teach people who hold extraordinary power the value of empathy and compassion for other human beings.
Yeah.
And I think, again, it's trying to connect. Our work is very similar, you know, that we're creating community of connection
Yes.
based upon human vulnerability and human strength.
Yes. Yeah.
It's
Because
the strength of the humanness that calls out. It's people don't connect to your website through a weakness. They do it through a strength.
yeah.
It's that call to live. It's that call to survive. It's that human essence to improve and to repair, that's hardwired into us. And so that's the power of your work.
Yeah.
And look, I work with people all over the economic spectrum. You know, so,
yeah, you do,
so
of course, and you have done in your past, you know, in LA and New York, you know, you've
right.
worked, you know, up at both sides of the spectrum, I know.
Right.
And, you know, I think that calls to the trauma therapist or the therapist in all of us that, you know, our job, and certainly personally my job, is to try and help people learn how to thrive. And thriving for me is such a profound word, which is why it's called Trauma Thrivers, because thriving for me is never about our material wealth or our status or our position. For me, thriving is about our ability to have a voice and feel valuable and feel worthy and do all that stuff that us as traumatized individuals find hard to do.
Right.
You know?
Because we were never properly seen or heard for
Yes.
who we are.
Yes.
And so it's been that struggle our whole lives to find a voice, which is, you know, it was really important for me to put Fragile Power out into the world, to feel like
Yes.
I had the authority and the experience to put my child out into the world. And so it's critically important for trauma thrivers to claim their voice and to claim connection and to honor their identity in a way that honors and enables them to provide value into the world. And what you're doing is extraordinarily valuable, and everybody who clicks on your website or who joins provides an extraordinary act of service. So for that, I'm grateful.
Well, I'm profoundly grateful for you today too, and your time. And I feel very touched that you've given me your time to come here and talk to me and our group. And I thank you, Dr. Paul, and any help that I can give you with what you're doing, I think it's phenomenal too. So great gratitude from us.
It's a two-way street. This needs to be a reciprocal relationship.
Okay, you've got that.
Thank you.
Question. Lovely to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.